Here's something I think about a lot. Every single school has at least one story like this floating around it. The kind that gets passed from one grade to the next until nobody can even remember who actually lived through it first. My old high school had one too. Except mine wasn't a story somebody made up to scare freshmen. I was actually there. So stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why I still think about a basement I haven't set foot in for over a decade. In high school, I was what you'd call a nerd. And back then, that word definitely wasn't something you wore as a badge of honor, the way people sometimes do now. For me and my friends, it felt more like getting punched in the stomach over and over. High school was just a different animal back then. You could genuinely get beaten up for liking the wrong band or not caring about sports. I know it sounds like a cliche at this point, but I promise you it was real. Junior year was the absolute worst for all of it. There was this kid, I'll call him Steve, who made our lives miserable for an entire year. Near the very end of the school year, Steve decided it would be a brilliant idea to break into the school after hours and pull some big prank, mostly just to prove to everyone how fearless he was. Well, Steve turned out to be so fearless that he got caught almost immediately. Before I keep going, you need a little background first, because it actually matters for what happens later. My school doesn't exist anymore. It's closed now, but back then, it was one of the more well-known private schools in the area. Uniforms, mandatory church services during the school day, the whole traditional package. The building itself was old, genuinely old, and before it ever became a school, it had apparently been some kind of hospital for the seriously ill. The story going around was that when they renovated the place in the 50s and tore up parts of the ground, they found a huge number of skeletal remains, people who had died from tuberculosis and other illnesses. Supposedly, instead of dealing with proper burials, the bodies had simply been moved through an underground tunnel that connected the old hospital to a building next door. Whether any of that was actually true or just something that had calcified into local legend over the decades, I genuinely couldn't tell you. But it became the kind of story that got passed down year after year among students, almost like folklore at this point. And given how old and genuinely creepy that building already looked, rumors that the place was haunted spread easily. Strange noises with zero explanation were just part of the daily background hum of attending that school, and naturally, everyone's default answer was always ghosts. The more boring, logical explanation is probably that the building was simply old and falling apart and made a lot of noise because of it. But where's the fun in that explanation, right? Anyway, back to Steve. He wanted to pull off this elaborate prank, so he broke in successfully, started tearing classrooms apart, throwing papers everywhere, even hit the library and pulled stacks of books off the shelves. Now you're probably wondering how exactly he got caught. To really put a bow on his whole ghost-themed stunt, he went to the art room, grabbed red paint, and started writing messages across the lockers. Total horror movie cliché stuff. Get out, your soul is next, that kind of thing. My personal favorite was simply, death is coming. While he was busy painting all this on the lockers, Steve later claimed he heard something coming from the basement. According to him, he walked to the basement door, and right before heading down, he saw shadows moving and heard voices coming up from the darkness below. He said it sounded evil, not like normal whispering at all, and it scared him badly enough that he bolted. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second though. If you were that scared enough to run from your own prank, would you still finish writing on the lockers afterward? Because that's exactly what he did. It didn't take school administration long at all to match his handwriting to the red paint on those lockers. They'd had more than enough of Steve's behavior by that point, and he was expelled the following week after a quick investigation. I will never forget the sound of him screaming on his way out of the principal's office, going on about something evil down in that basement. His words, not mine. I was completely convinced he was making the whole thing up just to save his own skin. Everyone else at school felt terrible for him, except me and my small group of friends, who couldn't stand the guy. In our opinion, he got exactly what he deserved. For the rest of the school year, we had to listen to people talk about how brave Steve had been, how he could have died down there. I'm not exaggerating even slightly. People genuinely believed evil spirits had been after him. As the year wound down, I floated an idea to my friends. On the very last day of school, we should break in ourselves and finish what Steve couldn't, prove once and for all there were no evil spirits, no ghosts, and most importantly, that Steve was a complete liar. Everyone agreed. The plan was simple. Break in quietly, get down to the basement, confirm it's just a basement, and leave. If we heard anything weird, we'd run immediately. No way were we getting caught the way Steve had. As nerdy teachers' pet types, getting caught would have ruined any shred of social standing we had left. I remember that night clearly. It was cold for early summer, and we all threw on sweatpants and jackets, fully leaning into our makeshift criminal aesthetic, hoods up, trying our best to look stealthy. Breaking in wasn't actually difficult, not because we were master criminals or anything, but because my friend Carson's mom worked as a janitor there and had a key, which was honestly half the reason we'd even decided to attempt this in the first place. Carson swiped the key, and we just walked in through the back entrance. I'll admit, it was genuinely unsettling inside. Anyone who has ever been in their own school after dark knows that particular feeling. I don't know if it's something we're hardwired for, but there's just something deeply unnerving about a school once all the lights are off and the halls are empty. Maybe it was years of ghost stories finally catching up with my subconscious. Urban legends really are powerful things once they've had enough time to settle into you. We eventually made our way to the basement door, and I'll admit, I was genuinely scared at that point. I didn't say anything to my friends because I didn't want to get made fun of, but my reasoning at the time was simple. I was already there, so I might as well see it through. We opened the door and saw nothing at first, just a dark staircase leading down into an even darker basement. Carson led, the rest of us followed behind. Cell phones weren't really a thing yet, definitely not with flashlights built in. So we were working with cheap dollar store flashlights, the kind that barely punched through real darkness. The basement itself was exactly as creepy as you'd expect from an old, dusty storage space in a building that age. Boxes everywhere. We poked through a few, old textbooks, Christmas decorations, spare uniforms. Honestly, the creepiest part for me personally was all the old religious statues scattered around. I can't fully explain why, but old religious statues have always unsettled me, the same way old churches sometimes do. We kept exploring for a few more minutes. No people anywhere. But we did discover just how massive that basement actually was. It genuinely felt like it stretched on forever, and our cheap flashlights couldn't even reach the far end from wherever we were standing. So here's a question for you. If you found yourself standing in a basement that large, that dark, with flashlights too weak to even see the back wall, would you keep going? Or would that be exactly the moment you turned around and left? We didn't turn around. We eventually reached one corner of the basement that felt noticeably colder than the rest, for whatever reason. We shifted some boxes out of the way and couldn't quite believe what we found. A small hole in the wall, roughly the size of a large beach ball, small, but definitely big enough for someone to crawl through. Carson immediately wanted to check it out. The rest of us were against it. We shone our flashlights through instead, and it just looked like a dark tunnel stretching off into nothing. We all had the exact same thought at once. This had to be the remains of that old tunnel, the one supposedly used to move bodies decades earlier. Carson convinced us we had to at least crawl in a little, just enough to look, if we genuinely wanted to prove there were no ghosts involved. We played rock, paper, scissors to decide who would go first. I lost. I started crawling through that dark tunnel, and almost immediately, I heard something. I stopped completely, assuming I had to be hearing things. I could hear my friends behind me laughing because I'd already paused this early. I told them to be quiet because I was genuinely hearing something and trying my hardest to listen. I could hear it clearly now, but I couldn't identify what it actually was. The closest way I can describe it is a whooshing sound, not wind exactly, something else entirely. I called out down the tunnel, and that whooshing slowly seemed to shift into something closer to whispering. I kept asking if anyone was there, and the whispering continued, growing slightly louder each time. Then, just as suddenly, it went completely silent. I could hear my friends behind me asking what was taking so long, but I couldn't even form an answer. I just sat there in that tunnel, flashlight aimed forward, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. I crawled forward a little more, and that's when my flashlight finally caught something. Squatting in the tunnel, maybe 15 feet ahead of me, was a person. They looked old, decrepit, barely human in the dim light. I shouted, but couldn't make myself move. The figure just stared back at me, with these vacant, half-open eyes. No shirt, painfully thin, ribs clearly visible even from that distance. I asked if they were okay. Nothing. No response. No movement. As I tried crawling backward, the figure lunged toward me, still in that crouched squatting position, making this unnaturally strange sound the entire time. Trying to scramble backward through that narrow tunnel while staring at this thing closing the distance was, without question, the most terrifying experience of my entire life. My friends had no idea what was happening until I finally cleared the tunnel opening, and right behind me, this person came crawling out as well. The second he stepped fully out of the hole, he lunged toward me like something feral, hands grasping. We sprinted for the stairs and never once looked back. By the time we got to the top and slammed the basement door shut behind us, we could still hear him down there, but he never actually chased us up the stairs. We ran straight out of the school and didn't stop until we made it back to my place. None of us could fully explain what we'd seen. I'm not saying it was some kind of undead spirit or anything supernatural, but that doesn't mean I have a tidy explanation either. The most logical answer I've ever managed to come up with is that the tunnel had to empty out somewhere, maybe an old sewer system, and that this was simply someone who'd been living down there, homeless or struggling with something else entirely, who'd found shelter underneath the school at some point. That's still the explanation I tell myself today. The one detail I can never shake, though, is the eyes. I had never seen eyes like that before that night, and I have never seen anything like them since. The school shut down for good years later, and when it finally happened, I found myself thinking about that tunnel again, wondering if it was still down there. If there's any chance at all that whatever I saw was something other than what I've convinced myself it was, I just hope tearing the building down finally gave him some kind of peace. Now let me ask you something before we move into the next story, because this one's going to hit very differently. How far would someone actually have to drive to make you regret a breakup you thought was completely harmless? After high school, my friend group scattered across colleges all over the state and beyond, myself included. Mine was about 8 hours away, 2 states over. I couldn't wait to get back home after finals, to see everyone again, and more importantly, to party properly. We'd already locked in plans for a massive party at my friend Logan's place. His family had this huge house out in the middle of nowhere, pool, big backyard with a fire pit, plenty of space to crash for the night. Perfect setup, especially since his parents happened to be out of town the very first weekend we were all back. Before the party, a small group of us grabbed food at the mall and swapped stories about our first year away at school. Mostly stories about whose campus had the better party scene. Somewhere in that conversation, Logan suggested turning it into a costume party. Felt like a weird idea for late May, but since none of us had been home for actual Halloween, this could basically be our version of it. Didn't take much convincing. We spread the word, told people to throw together costumes if they could on short notice, grabbed some candy corn from a local store, and called that our entire Halloween setup. I dug out an old, cheap Jason hockey mask from my basement and went as Casey Jones for the night. People started showing up around 10, drinks in hand, costumes thrown together last minute. The Purge movies were huge around then, so a good chunk of the girls showed up in Purge-inspired looks. Before long, the party had completely spiraled out of control in the best and worst ways. Like most parties we'd thrown before, way more people showed up than were actually invited. Since Logan's parents weren't home, and neighbors weren't really a concern out there, he didn't care, and just let people keep streaming in. I genuinely lost count of how many people ended up there, and with everyone in costume, I had no idea who half of them even were, beyond my close friends. A few hours in, I was out on the back deck, telling some drunk story, and I glanced up to notice a girl wearing one of those elegant masquerade masks standing inside the house. She seemed to be staring straight at me through the sliding glass door. I waved. She waved back, standing alone with a drink in a red cup. I asked around if anyone knew who she was. Nobody did. So here's a thought worth sitting with. When a complete stranger at a party locks eyes with you and waves first, is that ever actually as harmless as it feels in the moment? I went inside to talk to her, but as I got closer, she walked off deeper into the house. By the time I made it inside, she'd completely vanished. I looked around quickly, but didn't push it too hard, not wanting to come across as creepy in case she just wasn't interested, so I went back outside. Some time passed before I spotted her again. I jumped in the pool, mask still on, and while swimming, I looked up and saw her walking toward the back of the yard, alone. Logan's property didn't even have a fence, just a massive yard that fed straight into a tree line and a small patch of forest beyond it. She was heading directly for those trees. I called out a few times, though since I didn't actually know her name, I was basically just shouting random noise in her general direction. When she reached the tree line, she stopped, turned back, and waved at me again. I climbed out of the pool immediately, double-checking she was actually waving at me, and she clearly was. The gold of her mask catching the light, even from that distance. While I waved back, she gestured for me to follow her into the woods. I didn't think twice. I sprinted straight for the tree line. She was far enough ahead that by the time I actually got there, she was already gone from sight. Just to give you a sense of distance, standing right at those trees, I could barely even hear the music from the party anymore. I started calling out, "Hello, are you there?" That kind of thing. Still trying not to seem like I was full-on chasing her down, even though she'd clearly invited me to follow. I was scanning the darkness for any glint of moonlight off that gold mask and seeing nothing. After a couple minutes, I said out loud that I was heading back, since I was freezing, having jumped straight out of the pool without bothering to grab a shirt or even pants, just standing there, shivering in a cheap plastic hockey mask and swim trunks. I'd gotten so caught up chasing this mystery girl that I'd completely forgotten how cold I actually was. As I turned to head back toward the party, I heard a voice, soft, close, "Don't go back yet. Come find me first." That was all it took. I turned right back around and kept scanning the dark trees. I kept telling her I couldn't see her anywhere. A branch snapped to my left. Her voice answered from my right, saying she was just over here, suddenly turning flirtatious, telling me I looked cold and that she could warm me up. I know exactly how weak that line sounds typed out, but in the moment, half frozen and curious, it absolutely worked on me. I started walking toward her voice. A few feet in, I spotted her gold mask lying on the ground and picked it up. Genuinely a nice mask up close. I kept moving deeper into the trees, completely invested in this strange little chase by now, cold, forgotten entirely. Finally I saw her, standing a few feet away, too dark to make out her face clearly. White tank top, black shorts, dark hair hanging loose over her face. My incredibly smooth opening line was telling her I'd found her mask. She laughed, thanked me, asked if I'd bring it over. I started walking toward her. She didn't move at all, didn't even reach her arm out to take it. As I got closer, I noticed her head was tilted slightly down, hair still covering her face completely. I extended the mask toward her, told her my name was Kip. That's when she said, "I know who you are." Something about the voice finally clicked as familiar, though I still couldn't quite place it. I assumed she had to be someone from high school. When I was only a few inches away, she finally lifted her head. That's when I recognized her. A close friend of a girl I'd briefly dated back at college, 8 hours away. What on earth was she doing here? She stepped back, and from my left, I heard branches snapping again, fast this time. Before I could process anything, my ex was charging straight at me out of the dark, gripping a metal baseball bat, swinging directly for my head. I dropped to the ground, and somehow, she missed. She screamed and swung again overhead, missing a second time. I scrambled up and ran. That was the entire plan. Run. I sprinted all the way back to the party, screaming that someone was in the woods, which obviously killed the mood instantly. I was freezing and shaking purely from adrenaline at that point. Logan kicked nearly everyone out, except a handful of people staying overnight, but absolutely refused to call the police, worried about getting in trouble for the party itself. I clearly couldn't drive anywhere in that state, and I was terrified the rest of the night. I made Logan personally check every single lock in the house. I watched the back windows for hours, but never confirmed anyone was actually still out there in that tree line. It was simply too far away to tell. The second the sun started coming up, I got in my car and left. I genuinely could not wrap my head around the fact that this girl had driven 8 hours to attack me, possibly worse. I had no idea I'd left that strong an impression on her. We dated for maybe a few weeks total before I ended things, because honestly, she'd started seeming a little unhinged, constantly wanting access to my phone, my email, which I hated but never actually denied her. I'd get back to my dorm after class, and she'd already be sitting in my room, demanding to know why I was 2 minutes late. Way too intense for something only a few weeks old. Turns out my supposedly harmless breakup wasn't quite as harmless as I'd assumed. I spent the rest of that summer constantly checking over my shoulder. Any girl who even remotely resembled her, I was getting in my car and leaving immediately. If nothing else, that night genuinely matured me. I cut back on drinking, stopped partying nearly as hard after that. She never went back to her college the following year, and I never saw her again. I tracked her social media for a while, out of pure anxiety, but eventually, those accounts disappeared too. Be careful what you say to people and how you end things. What feels completely harmless to you can land entirely differently for someone else. I genuinely cannot imagine the thought process behind driving 8 hours with a plan to cause real harm. If that bat had connected even once, I don't think I'd be sitting here telling you any of this. Last one, and this one still makes my stomach turn more than the other two combined, because of who it actually involves. Last year I landed my first real extended substitute position. I'd been subbing around the area for a while already, but in April, one of the teachers at a school I subbed at frequently went on maternity leave, and I stepped in as one of the history teachers straight through until the end of June. Honestly, those months were genuinely great. Substitute teaching can be brutal, depending on the school and age group, but I was working with seniors, and by April most seniors are already mentally checked out for the year anyway. I kept lessons short and engaging. We were covering government at that point in the curriculum, so instead of drowning students in lectures, I leaned into open debates, teaching them how to actually talk to people who disagree with them. Controversial approach maybe, but it ended up being incredibly rewarding to watch. Finals wrapped up. Summer break approached. Last day of school was the usual half day, capped off with an awards ceremony. Afterward, students started drifting out for summer, plenty of seniors saying their final goodbyes to teachers. I headed back to my classroom to start packing things up, wanting everything perfect for when the regular teacher returned in the fall. Almost finished, the principal spotted me still there and asked if we could talk about my future at the school. We ended up chatting for nearly an hour. He'd been impressed with my teaching style and said he'd try to find a way to bring me on for the fall semester. I was thrilled. We started walking out together, and right before stepping outside, I realized I'd left my purse back in the classroom. I said goodbye to him and headed back. The building was nearly empty by then, maybe a handful of teachers left. When I got back to my classroom, I was genuinely startled. Standing right next to my desk was one of my students, a quiet but genuinely brilliant kid I'll call Ben. I asked what he was doing in there. He just looked at me and shrugged, said nothing. I asked if he was okay, and very quietly he said he was fine, just thinking. So here's the part I want you to really sit with for a second. What would you have done in that exact moment, alone in an empty school building with a student who won't quite explain why he's still there? I told him he couldn't be in there and needed to leave. I felt deeply uncomfortable, not knowing the right protocol for a situation like that, not wanting to just abandon a kid alone in an empty school either. While I was still trying to process what to even say next, Ben slowly started walking toward the door. I felt relieved he was finally leaving. At the doorway, he stopped, didn't turn around, just kept facing forward and said, "Thank you. I'm sure I'll see you around." That sentence alone might sound harmless typed out, but you genuinely had to hear how he said it. Something about the entire interaction left me deeply uneasy in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Once he finally left, I went to grab my purse. I usually kept it in one of my desk drawers, but it was sitting on a chair next to the desk instead. My first thought was that Ben had tried to take something from it. I checked everything frantically, but it all appeared accounted for. Even the cash in my wallet was untouched. I figured maybe he'd attempted something and his conscience had gotten the better of him before he could follow through. A few nights later, my husband and I were enjoying a quiet evening around our backyard fire pit, our 7-year-old son staying at his cousin's house for the weekend, giving us a rare bit of alone time. While outside, we heard a strange rustling sound from behind the shed. I kept telling my husband it was probably just a rodent and to leave it be. Around midnight, we headed inside for the night. Right before going in, my husband mentioned he wanted to check the shed first. I told him to watch out for skunks and went in ahead of him to start getting ready for bed. After a while, I realized he still hadn't come inside. When he finally did, he explained that when he first looked behind the shed, he hadn't seen anything unusual. But walking around to the front, he noticed the shed door was cracked open slightly. Inside, he thought he saw muddy footprints, though he wasn't fully certain. That sent him back around behind the shed again, where the muddy ground looked like it had been stepped in repeatedly, though again, he couldn't say for sure. He genuinely wondered if his own anxiety was making him see patterns that weren't actually there. I wasn't nearly as worried as he seemed to be. Seemed entirely plausible he'd just left the shed door open himself at some point. The next morning I got up before him, headed downstairs for coffee, and noticed the back door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just not fully latched. I assumed that after all the commotion with the shed the night before, he'd simply forgotten to close it properly. I shut and locked it, and went about my day without thinking much more of it. That night, he stayed up late, watching a ball game, while I dozed off on the couch waiting for him. After the game ended, he woke me, and we headed up to bed together. Once I was lying there, sleep just wouldn't come. I kept shifting, unable to get comfortable, this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Since sleep clearly wasn't happening, I quietly slipped out of bed to go read in the living room, trying not to wake my husband. Walking down the hallway, I froze completely. Standing at the far end of the hall was the dark outline of a figure. I slowly reached for the light switch. When the light came on, standing at the end of that hallway, right outside my son's bedroom door, was Ben, from my classroom. I had absolutely no idea what to say or do. He smiled and said, "Hey, Miss Jones, nice house." Then he simply walked into my son's bedroom and shut the door behind him. He was holding something in his hand, though I couldn't make out what from where I stood. I ran back into my bedroom and dialed 911 immediately, waking my husband, who sprinted straight to our son's room. As he entered, Ben was already trying to climb out the window. My husband lunged to grab him, but Ben jumped from the second-story window straight to the ground, landed on his feet, and took off running. My husband stayed with me, waiting for police to arrive. I gave them everything: who Ben was, where he went. They went to his house and spoke directly with his parents, who insisted he'd been home all night. When officers questioned Ben himself, he claimed he'd been asleep for hours and couldn't possibly have been at my house. Police essentially told me there was nothing they could do at that point. It felt insane to hear. This kid had physically been inside my home. They told me to call again if anything else happened, but until then, their hands were tied. I barely left the house for the rest of that summer, changed every single lock, invested heavily in security cameras around the entire property. My husband theorized he'd likely pulled our home address straight off my driver's license, which had been sitting in my purse, explaining exactly why it had ended up on that chair instead of in the drawer. What genuinely makes me sick to this day is that he'd gone into my son's room specifically. I can't even let myself imagine what he might have been planning. My son ended up spending most of that summer at his cousin's house because I simply couldn't stomach the idea of him sleeping at home. When he's older, I'll explain why. As of right now, I have no idea where Ben currently is. Thankfully, there's never been a second incident. I still don't fully understand it though. He was always such a polite, respectful kid in class. Never gave anyone a single problem. That night in the hallway was honestly the first time in my life I got to witness real-time what people mean when they talk about a mother's intuition. If I'd stayed in bed even 10 more seconds, I never would have seen him standing there at all. We currently have the house listed and are hoping to move very soon. The day we're finally out of there is the day I expect I'll actually sleep through an entire night again. So that's all 3. If any of these got under your skin even a little, especially that last one, let me know in the comments which story hit you hardest, and tell me what time it is right now wherever you're watching from, because something about hearing these late at night just hits differently. And if you want more stories exactly like these, real, slow building, no ghosts required, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another one coming.